In my previous entry, I mentioned that after a 4-month delay, Academia EDU has published my paper, my 1,600-word short paper having to do with the rag picker or bound and free. That's something that they've just recently instituted it, and the software just puts out the invitation, I guess, to all the members. And they advertise that it should only take a couple weeks to get it reviewed, as opposed to submitting to a real journal, which might take weeks or months. And looking at the stats, from the 10th to the 12th, I had 83 unique visits, but they don't all indicate that people read the paper. Apparently the software hasn't caught up to their new program here. Apparently only 6 papers have been read according to the software, and all of these say that they looked at my profile. Well, I can hardly imagine that 77 people, looked at my profile and didn't read the paper. So something's a little strange there, but it's created something of a buzz. And yet, aside from the comments made by the 2 reviewers, it doesn't seem like anybody has joined the discussion, because this is put out for a quote unquote discussion. So nobody wants to engage in it. And yet a lot of people are curious about it. And this is just a very small thing. I mean, I've thought of several papers I could write like this. I just submitted another one concerning the vulture, which I talked about very recently. We'll see how that goes. Maybe they'll get that one reviewed in a couple of weeks. We'll see if it gets accepted. I mean, but there's so many of these little stories concerning Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, which was claimed for or claimed by other authors, not just the famous ones concerning Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens. So I can keep supplying them with 1,600-word papers ad infinitum, So let's see what happens. That may be the way in, is these little things, as I mentioned last time. Now, I also talked about the Knickerbocker, that I had discovered a new body of Mathew Franklin Whittier's work in the Knickerbocker. And I had in mind to wait till I got all of my antiquarian volumes in. But I also was hoping that, because you can get these things in PDF form in HathiTrust, I found. Although not being affiliated with academia, I don't have the ability to download the entire book. I can look through and download individual pages, and then using a program, a free program, it's SAM PDF or PDF SAM, I think it's called, in fairness to them, to stitch the PDFs together. I've done that with entire books that I've downloaded page by page from HathiTrust and then stitched together with PDF SAM. When there's a will, there's a way. Well, anyway, I got the first volume, which is volume 45, which is the first half of 1855. I think you can see that here. The title of the publication has long since disappeared. But I was hoping that, okay, this is 2 characters that Mathew created. This is P. Pepper Pod, who is introducing his rustic friend's poetry, and his rustic friend is named K.N., the initials K.N. Pepper. So we have P. Pepper Pod sending in the poetry of K.N. Pepper, and it's not made clear if they're relations. It doesn't sound like they are. Now, I went through this the last time, so I won't elaborate on it, but this is typical of Mathew Franklin Whittier's pseudonyms. He apparently had a childhood nickname, Peter Pumpkin, and people would also say of him that boy is some pumpkins, like a pistol, we'd say today. So based on a great many clues, I've extrapolated that Mathew loved pumpkin pie, that he was a pistol, that they called him some pumpkins, and that his name was Peter Pumpkin, his nickname. So he used variations on this pseudonym, and I found, a grand total of 21 instances where he has signed with a pseudonym using a double P like this. And of those 21, 11 of them start with Peter. I'm going to read them because I know that people actually, I don't know if they don't believe me or they just take everything with a grain of salt. You kind of have to just shove things in people's face sometimes. So I'm going to read them. Phineas Pica, Peter Pry, Peter Pico, Peter Popkins, Peter Pallet, Peter Pushaway, Pitch Pine, Paul Parvenu, Peter Prosy, Peltiah Peabody, and then just the initials PP. There's a bunch of instances of that. Peter Peregrine Pry, Peter Pendergrass, Peter Pinchback, Philo Porcus, Patchwork Peep, that was a girl, Peter Pipkins. All of those are before 1853 when this series started. Then after, in 1853 or after, we have Paul Pickle, Patty Pumple, her husband Peter Pumple, and Periwinkle Popkins. Okay? So, I mean, you know, proof you have to get from my books because it's all a big tapestry and it all fits together and you have to see the whole thing. But, you know, P. Pepper Pod is Peter Pepper Pod, and that is Mathew Franklin Whittier, once again using another one of his Peter Pumpkin type pseudonyms. And K.N. Pepper, whom I found in Matthew's Portland transcript, letters to the editor from Caleb Leathers, that's also Mathew. So what he's done is create this kind of normal character who's introducing the poetry of this extremely rustic character who imagines that he's a great poet. See? And I've explained how Mathew writes in layers so that it's supposed to be a joke. It's supposed to be a lampoon, but it actually isn't. It's autobiographical in a very particular sense, that Mathew, who has self-deprecating humor and has a very low self-esteem but is brilliant, he is the real genius, you know, who's clowning like Victor Borgia and presenting himself as a clown, see, writing stupid, ignorant poetry. He presents himself as an idiot who seems to imagine himself as a great poet when actually he is a great poet, but he's so shy he doesn't dare, you know, show his real work with his real name. Well, I had hoped, and I've seen this before, that if he was submitting corny work like this to this journal, he would slip in one or two real ones, see, and I was right. I was dead on. So that's what I discovered yesterday, and I can't absolutely prove it, but I feel it, and by style, this is absolutely Mathew's, and it ties in very nicely with some of the, at least one of the famous ones, see. So it's pretty interesting stuff. So we're going to proceed. This is not going to be proof I'm sharing, okay? I'm sharing and creating a public marker for having discovered this, but I can't prove it to skeptical people. So this is not intended to prove to skeptical people. This is intended to share with people now or in the future who respect my work and respect me. I get my notes here. In the January edition of the Knickerbocker, 1855, we have an epic poem praising the first Quaker martyr. It's on page 49 for those of you who want to look it up. It's called Lays of Quakerdom, and it's about James Farnell, the Quaker proto-martyr, and there is a prose introduction. Now, the very last sentence, paragraph and sentence of this introduction reads, I have to bring my light down here. It's very small type. It's amazing. This is like 6-point type. I don't know why I guess they have to cram a whole bunch of stuff in. So he's talking about this martyr who had died in prison. He says, so he departed, leaving his name to be numbered with those who in all ages have lived and labored and suffered, italics, for the spiritual emancipation of man. That is autobiographical. That is an autobiographical touch by Mathew. So we're going to come back to that because I'm convinced that was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, and we're going to compare it with a couple other poems. But I want to skip over to the first of K.N. Pepper's great poems, his great poem, because he kept talking about how, you know, his muse was going to help him write a great poem, see? And this is it. It's called Wheelbearer, Weelbarer, and the plot is that the character, Abner, this country character, swears. He loses his self-control and he swears. And the wheelbarrow hears and pushes him into hell. So, Matthew grew up with this kind of religion. I know that the Whittier's religion was fundamentalist in this way. It was really more Puritan than Quaker, if you ask me. Because in Elizabeth Whittier's diary, the younger sister of both John Greenleaf Whittier and Matthew, she talks like that, exactly as you would expect a Puritan to talk about kind of religious guilt, this overwhelming religious guilt about how sinful she is. And of course, this little girl wasn't sinful at all, really. But, her terrible sins and everything, so they were raised with that. So Matthew apparently is lampooning that whole idea that because somebody has let loose with a swear word, that they are going to get pushed into eternal hell. So he didn't believe anything like that. So he was lampooning that. But the language, let me start it. Gosh, that type is small. Dedicate, meaning dedicated, to P. Pepper Pod by the author, Mr. K.N. Pepper, Esquire. Of course, Matthew puts Esquire after his name. Now, I'm going to have to hold this up and see if I can read it. I'm going to put this on the screen. This is extremely difficult to read because it's all in horrible misspelling. This is straight up Matthew's style since he wrote Joe Strickland in 1825 as a boy of 12 for the New York National Advocate and then the New England Galaxy were the papers he was writing for in Boston and New York City. As a boy of 12, it goes right back to that style that he inaugurated in America. But here he's using it with this character, and many times these misspellings are, if they're not intentionally meant to convey a different meaning, like a meaningful Freudian slip of some kind, they're meant to just look ridiculous because the spelling means something completely different than he intends. And it's just very hard to read. Sometimes I can't tell what he's getting at until I say it 2 or 3 times. So I'm going to do my best with this live. Not that I'm in anything of a hurry, O Muse. It's comforting to know you got a muse. Would I address thee on the subject of a large poem? For various is the opportunities I've given to thee to walk up to the captain's office and there to settle or make you friend an offer. But you have slighted all my overtures. Oh, is my precious muse a-going to leave and finally be no more heard of anywheres? Can nothing warm her at present cold shoulder? Return and smile on Pepper, oh his muse. Remember he's dissolved all partnership with everything and is an unhappy bird as thinks of flying only a few days longer. Come and help smooth his delicate white plumage and teach his poor voice only one more song. So then he'll go in peace and you may find consolation in funerals and such. Now heaven be praised. My muse, she is a-coming. So what I'm going to do with each of these is just read the first couple stanzas and then kind of arbitrarily skip into the middle of the poem and read a couple more samples. O Abner, that's the main character, fly, and to your speed add wings, parentheses, from Milton. So you see, Matthew is actually quoting, major authors in the middle of this. No need to tell him, for the cuss did fly. He came soon to a river, Bangs was high, and thinking it might be Gordon, was afeard. A little circumstance confirmed his suspicions. He heard the squeak of the wheelbarrow, and a awful rumbling sound, and afore being quite prepared, was bucked in. See, the wheelbarrow is chasing him and pushing him into hell. This was a new cause for dissatisfaction, so he swum across the rifts quite angry-like, but got out so refreshed that he made 240 with a ease unparalleled, considering the strangeness of the cadentry. Now, these were typical Mathew phrases. 240 is a racing term, and Mathew used it a number of times. Well, not a whole bunch of times that I can find, but 3, 4, 5 times, something like that. And cadentry was one of his typical spellings for country. So there's little bits and pieces of Ethan Spike that show up in here, and he was writing Ethan Spike parallel with this. For example, instead of saying unmitigated, he would say unmitigated, O-M. Well, Mathew primarily used that in Ethan Spike, and he used it in here. So there's a bunch of indicators, but you get the tenor of the thing. Let's go to another one in the same volume. Apparently there was an eclipse of the moon. I don't know if they mean eclipse of the sun, or I'm not sure what they're referring to there. But it's called Eclipse, and it's in the June edition, 1855. E-K-L-I-P-S, Eclipse. And I'll just read, I might read all of that because this one's short. Behold the moon diminish into nothing. At once he's cheat, his bright career cut off. Once he was rejoicing as he was able to afford such a good article of light, he being small and not yet got his growth. But the praises as was lavish unto him had the effect to unsettle his mind. See, Mathew was very much afraid of fame. I've talked about this before. He wasn't sure that he could handle fame, so he kept studiously anonymous for that reason, as well as other reasons, like to hide his involvement with the Underground Railroad and things of that nature. He thought of his rivals as was jealous and was afraid he'd get hurt, or what's worse, to a sensitive luminary, squenched. So he's afraid of rivals in this rendering. He's actually afraid of pro-slavery zealots, is one of the main reasons he doesn't come forward. So he means that he's had death threats, is the thing. Not because he's an excellent poet. I mean, that was a whole nother issue. His worst fears all us are sadly realized. Although he would shine, yet we see he can't. In consequence of a peculiar arrangement, all of his efforts don't do no good. Why did earth step in so furious, and elbow off the track the sweet moon as had delighted thousands? Why? Did I say why? I said why. Evidently because he was burning too much oil, meaning oil. He was exerting of himself in an unnatural manner. See, unnatural instead of unnatural. That's Ethan Spike talk. Could he expect to shine so allers? Didn't earth know it? Does earth know anything? Has he administered a check onto the occasion? Why did the clouds, C-L-O-W-D-S, come up and complete the scene? Why? Because all nature sympathize. They regulates each other. When I goes it too fast for his health, they all reson with him, first mild. And if that don't do no good, then rather stronger, as we see. It's supposed that 2 or 3 such corrections in a year is all as keeps him from making a fool of hisself. But my muse she is a-leaving. She's afeared to trust her pepper since the great poem, which means the wheelbarrow poem. I spec it was rather hard on her, judging from my own melancholy situation, which is bad. Alas, like unfortunate moon, the poet, was too careless in the use of his isle. His fireworks was fine, but too expensive. And he is presently an aggravated human eclipse of the worst kind. Such is the misfortunes of genus. So that's Mathew speaking as his fool, K.N. Pepper, about himself autobiographically. So he's talking about his own genius, which he knows he has, and the reception that he gets and is going to get, and that he expects to get, not only from other literary figures, which he may ridicule him, but also in terms of his anti-slavery work, what he expects from them. Now, let's go back to this poem. This is about James Parnell, Lays of Quakerdom, and it's about the first Quaker martyr who apparently began preaching kind of like St. Francis and was thrown in prison and died in prison. Now let's set the stage for this a little bit. Here we have, see if we can see it, a pamphlet, a reprint of a eulogy given by Reverend David Root, and it's called A Memorial of the Martyred Lovejoy in a discourse by Reverend David Root, delivered in Dover, New Hampshire, and published by request. Now, I can't go into all the reasons I say this, but this was written by Mathew and Abby Whittier, who were members of the First Parish Church. They had eloped to Dover in August of 1836. They had been writing sermons, anti-slavery sermons for David Root, and this was one of them. I'm quite certain of it. If you look at David Root's own unassisted sermons, they're nothing like this at all. Very stuffy, very pedantic. Nothing like this, So I'm just going to read a little bit of it. What happened, I think, extrapolating, reading between the lines, Mathew and Abby were writing some very pointed letters to the editor, pro-abolition letters to the editor, under the pseudonym Kappa, Lambda, and Mu, where Kappa meant a kappa, a Japanese river sprite. Lambda is the symbol on Spartan shields, which means that Mathew was very protective of his feelings, or as he called them, feelings, and that shows up in cayenne pepper, feelings. And Mu was their, their unborn child at that time, and they were under threats. They'd been discovered. This was a cotton mill town. Dover, New Hampshire was a cotton mill town. Nobody who was anti-slavery, no abolitionist was going to be tolerated in a cotton mill town. They were very naive, as this young couple. So they wrote this eulogy for Root, and I think as soon as that service was over, they skedaddled out of there to Amesbury, Mass. That's the way I read it. This was their parting shot, basically. But Elijah Lovejoy was a martyr. He, let's see, I've got it written down here. He was killed by a mob in his printing office in Alton, Illinois on November 7, 1836. So this would have to have been given sometime after November 7, 1836. So I'll read a little bit of it. Again, I think I'll read from the start and then I'll go into it a little bit. I'll take it out of its protective cover. These things are really going to be precious someday. People have no idea, There's a quote here from Acts, and then he says, "My Christian brethren and fellow citizens, an occasion of rare and affecting interest has summoned us in solemn convocation this evening. Not merely that a fellow man has expired, not merely that a Christian has departed, not merely that a beloved brother minister of the gospel has gone to his rest, but that an American citizen, in the exercise of his rights guaranteed to him by God and the Constitution of his country, has fallen by the hand of violence, quote, fallen by the fury of a free people murdering in defense of slavery, fallen a martyr in support of principles dear to every Christian, every American bosom. Yes, Lovejoy is no more, that beloved brother, that champion of liberty, that Christian hero, that uncompromising friend of the defenseless, downtrodden slave, whose movements in the cause of the oppressed for the last 6 months we have contemplated with admiration, has been sacrificed by wicked hands upon the altar of his country's liberty in bearing testimony to the truth, and his name is henceforth to be enrolled upon the calendar of Christian martyrs." So that's just the first couple paragraphs. I'm going to go in somewhat arbitrarily. So he's introducing this. What are the doctrines of anti-slavery men? He says, first principles. 1. Abolitionists hold that, quote, all men are born free and equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, small caps, and the pursuit of happiness. They do not believe that these rights are abrogated or at all modified by the color of the skin, but that they extend alike to every individual of the human family. 2. As the above-mentioned rights are in their nature inalienable, it is not possible that one man can convert another into a piece of property, thus at once annihilating all his personal rights, without the most flagrant injustice and usurpation. But American slavery does this. It declares a slave to be a, quote, thing, a, quote, chattel, an article of personal, quote, property, a piece of, quote, merchandise, and now actually holds 2.5 million of our fellow men in this precise condition. So he goes on with that. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier, the younger brother of John Greenleaf Whittier. This is not actually Reverend David Root. And Abby looking on over his shoulder. So this is also Abby's work. Because Abby is the one who apparently converted Matthew from the idea of colonization to abolition. So Matthew is the powerhouse behind all kinds of things, but Abby is the powerhouse behind Matthew. Now, I'm going to start out this poem concerning the first Quaker martyr. Remember that Matthew was raised Quaker. And then I'll jump into the middle of it as I've been doing. It was June, her bloom and beauty, then the queenly month displayed, and in her rich robes of summer, all the joyous earth arrayed. And that's just a separate little introduction. He says, now the Quaker near his homestead, in the woodland on the hill, stood beside the stream proclaiming all its mission to the mill. Busy down beneath the chestnuts, by the meadows green and still, there the willows o'er the water, loving patrons of the stream, bend to see it run and ramble, or to watch it sleep and dream, never weary of its music, glad to hear it sing along, all their lines of grace and beauty waving plaudits of the song. But the statelier beech and maple to the hillside group withdrew, where the old oak, vast and rugged, in his simple grandeur grew. Well, that's, you catch the rhythm here. This is Matthew's preferred style and his preferred meter. You will see it in any number of poems, including The Raven and in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, both of which were written by Matthew. We're going to move forward. I'm just going to arbitrarily jump in halfway. Men and brethren, poor and sinful, wanderers from the way of right, have ye nothing left to live for, but to swear and brawl and fight? Though ye seem of men forsaken, God is dwelling near to you, and he seeth with your evil all the little good ye do. Ever in your souls his spirit with your sinful purpose strives, and he seeketh thus to win you back to better, happier lives. Listen to his holy teaching, ere your cups of woe be full. Though your sins are as the scarlet, he will make them white as wool. To your low estates he bringeth power and pity from above, greater than all human mercy, stronger than all human love. This is him preaching, see? So that's Mathew Franklin Whittier. This is completely unsigned. There is no clue to the authorship, because as soon as Matthew gets serious, he hides his identity. He does not want anybody figuring out that he was writing that serious poetry. He's not going to put himself up to ridicule. He's not going to be discovered. When he's writing clownishly as K.N. Pepper, then, maybe somebody's going to figure out who it is. Now, I don't even have proof that Matthew's writing this Quaker poem, see? I know it's him. I'm convinced of it. Now, I wasn't sure here's how I discovered it. I looked at it and I said, man, that's good. That's really good. And I've had this reaction several times. I think, gosh, there's several people that could write well like Matthew. And I looked at it again. I said, that's Quaker, and it sounds like Matthew. And then I started reading. I said, gosh, that's in his accustomed preferred meter, And I read it some more. That's Matthew. It goes like that. That's the way I slowly wake up to the possibility. I start out skeptical. So here we have from 1844. It's called Poems. It's by Elizabeth Barrett Barrett, who will become Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This is the 2-volume set. that she published in England. This is one of the 2 volumes. I think this is volume 2. See if you can see that through the glare. It's very fragile, by the way. The English did not use rag paper, apparently, and their books are very fragile compared to the American newspapers and books. So you touch one of these things, and it'll chip off. You know, the corner will chip off or whatever. It's very fragile. So here we have, there you can see it, The Lost Bower. Okay, this was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. This was not written by Elizabeth Barrett. I'm absolutely certain of it. He must have sent it to her possibly in 1838, because apparently he sent his and maybe some of Abby's poems to her in 1838, believing that an essay on mind had been her original poem published, I think it was in 1826. I don't believe it was. I think she plagiarized that and started her reputation and fooled a whole bunch of people, because that was an excellent poem written by we'll never know whom. And she pretended she had written it, and she fooled all kinds of people, including Matthew and possibly Abby, although I think Abby had more insight and sometimes would say, I don't think so, and Matthew would override her, say. So anyway, they apparently sent her some poems in 1838, and then after Abby died in 1841, Matthew sent her some more poems. And I'll go into that in a minute because we've got an example of one of those. The Cry of the Children, I think that was Abby Poyen Whittier. I don't think that was Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And there's a nice little clue in that, because one of the stanzas talks about the country of the free. And I think it was originally the home of the free from the Star Spangled Banner that Abby had put in there just as a colloquial reference. And Barrett either wasn't familiar with the Star Spangled Banner and didn't know what a giveaway clue that would be, or she just kind of luckily decided that home should be changed to country, you know, and imagined that nobody would figure it out. Anyway, the Cry of the Children that everybody thinks is so wonderful, that's Abby. That's her compassion for the poor children that had to work in horrible conditions, not Elizabeth Barrett. I make a very strong case, by the way, for Elizabeth Barrett as a plagiarist, if you read my paper. Now, The Lost Bower, it's basically about Matthew as a boy, who as a boy used to tear through the brambles. Little Elizabeth Barrett in her dress did not tear through the brambles when she was a girl. And he found a place that he never could find again. And the inference is that he had a kind of a dimensional shift experience where he experienced the astral realm and then could never experience it again. It's a grief poem because it was written about the same time as The Raven, probably, because Matthew went back and forth between belief and disbelief. And The Raven is a poem where his disbelief won out, and The Lost Bower is a poem where his belief won out because he said, wait a minute, I know heaven is real because I experienced it when I was a boy, and he wrote about that. So it's during this same period when he's wrestling with his faith in the other world. So he starts out, just to give you a sense of the meter here. In the pleasant orchard closes, God bless all our gains, say we, but may God bless all our losses, better suits with our degree. Listen, gentle, I and simple, listen, children on the knee. Green the land is where my daily steps in jocund childhood played, dimpled close with hill and valley, dappled very close with shade. Summer snow of apple blossoms running up from glade to glade. There is one hill I see nearer in my vision of the rest, and a little wood seems clearer as it climbeth from the west, sideway from the tree-locked valley to the airy upland crest. It's exactly the same meter that you see in this poem about the Quaker. So I'm going to move into the middle of the poem, again arbitrarily. But that bower appeared a marvel in the wildness of the place, with such seeming art and travail. Finely fixed and fitted was leaf to leaf, the dark green ivy to the summit from the base. And the ivy, veined and glossy, was inwrought with eglantine, and the wild hop fibred closely, and the large-leaved columbine, arch of door and window mullion, did write so vainly entwine. So I don't know if I read that correctly, but you get the gist. It's exactly the same meter. This was Mathew Franklin Whittier's preferred meter. And when people have compared the style of The Raven with the style of Lady Geraldine's Courtship, the reason is that Mathew wrote both of those poems. Now, right immediately following the Lost Bower in this text is a child asleep. There it is. I get dyslexic. Child asleep. Now, it was pointed out to me by a helpful scholar who was telling me, by way of dismissing everything that I was trying to tell her, that A Child Asleep was actually first published by Elizabeth Barrett in something called Finden's Tableau, in 1840, 4 years earlier. It was called The Dream there. And apparently, as I've analyzed this, she took Mathew's original and revised it twice separately, once for Finden's and again for her compilation. In other words, she went back the second time to Mathew's original and revised it again. And the reason I say that is I can tell which is original, which stanzas are original, and which she stuck in. The ones she stuck in are not authentic, just like when Dickens brought in the Ghost of Christmas Present and made him a huge bare-chested giant, that loved meat and had meat dishes all around him. Well, that's Dickens, the worldly person, sticking his dirty thumb into Mathew and Abby's spiritual work, see? Well, Elizabeth Barrett was the same way. I can tell which of her stanzas she stuck in to Mathew and Abby's more advanced spiritualist and mystical understanding, see? So the first two stanzas, I believe, in both cases they're the same, and the first two stanzas are Mathew's and Abby's, because I think they wrote together. She would give, just like John Greenleaf and his little sister Elizabeth, she would give him feedback on his poems. I think it was the same with Mathew and Abby. So we have to count Abby in when we look at Mathew's work that was done during her lifetime. So this is called A Child Asleep, and the first two stanzas read, "How he sleepeth, having drunken weary childhood's mandragore, from his pretty eyes have sunken pleasures to make room for more, sleeping near the withered nosegay which he pulled the day before. Nosegays, leave them for the waking, throw them earthward where they grew. Dim are such beside the breaking amaranths he looks unto. Folded eyes see brighter colors than the open ever do." So Mathew and Abby strongly believe in the reality of heaven and the higher realms. What they're saying is that their little son, Joseph, because this is written about their first child, Joseph Whittier, that when he's sleeping, he is experiencing the higher realms. And they clearly believe that. Now, where Elizabeth Barrett sticks in her stanzas, she doesn't. She's a skeptic, and you can clearly tell the difference. But the point here is that this is the same author as in 1855, presumably he wrote it then, this poem about the first Quaker martyrs. They're very closely comparable. And I'll go back and read a little bit of that. But let's go into the middle of A Child Asleep. The Cry of the Children, by the way, is immediately after. So she appears to have ganged together the poems that she plagiarized from Mathew and Abby. We have three of them back to back. The Lost Bower, A Child Asleep, and then comes The Cry of the Children. What's after that? Then there's something else that she wrote. So she put three of them together. Very lazy, So I'm going to jump right in the middle, but let me try to find one that I feel was Mathew and Abby's. "Vision unto vision calleth, while the young child dreameth on. Fair, O dreamer, thee befalleth with the glory thou hast won. Darker wert thou in the garden, yestermorn by summer's sun. We should see the spirits ringing round thee, were the clouds away. 'Tis the child heart draws them, singing, and the silent seeming clay. Singing, stars that seem the mutest, go in music all the way." Now, I have a poem by Abby, which was falsely claimed by Albert Pike, in which she talks about the stars as living beings. So, in other words, we can't hear the stars singing the music of the spheres. But see, Abby knows, as a mystic, a well-studied mystic, that there is such a thing as the music of the spheres. She believes in it. So that's a reference to it here. And the previous stanza says that the glory that he's seeing on the higher planes makes the summer sun that he was under the day before seem dark. So these are believers. It's just like in A Christmas Carol when they start out saying Marley was dead. Nothing can come of this story unless you understand that Marley was dead. Those were believers in the other world. Dickens was a skeptic. It couldn't possibly have been written, that introduction by Charles Dickens. You see the difference? And you know why this has skipped everybody's attention? Because all of these scholars are materialists. A truly spiritual person would never be fooled by this. You know? It's the materialism of the scholars which has blinded them and allowed them to imagine that Elizabeth Barrett could have written this, that Charles Dickens could have written A Christmas Carol, that Edgar Allan Poe could have written The Raven. No spiritually awake person would ever imagine such a thing. See? So let's go back. We've just read The Lost Bower. Hopefully you still have it in your mind, or maybe I should read a little bit of it again just to really put it back to back here. I know I'm kind of disjointed today. Vision unto vision calleth, while the young child dreameth on. Fair, O dreamer, thee befalleth with the glory thou hast won. See, that doesn't quite make sense. I'm wondering if Elizabeth Barrett didn't change the wording in here somewhere. I don't understand thee befalleth with the glory. Maybe there's a meaning to that, but when I read these stanzas and they don't quite make sense, most of the time that's because the plagiarist has altered something. She didn't understand the meaning, so something sounded better to her and she stuck in a different word. So that could be the case here. Let me go to this next stanza. We should see the spirits ringing round thee were the clouds away. 'Tis the child heart draws them, singing in the silent seeming clay. Singing, stars that seem the mutest go in music all the way. Now we're going to immediately jump over to this poem. Men and brethren, poor and sinful, wanderers from the way of right, have ye nothing left to live for but to swear and brawl and fight? Though ye seem of men forsaken, God is dwelling near to you, and he seeth with your evil all the little good ye do. Ever in your souls his spirit with your sinful purpose strives, and he seeketh thus to win you back to better, happier lives. Listen to his holy teaching ere your cups of woe be full. Though your sins are as the scarlet, he will make them white as wool. It's the same author. This is a deeply spiritual mystic who is hiding, assiduously hiding from view. And when worldly plagiarists get hold of their work, which didn't happen in this case, when worldly plagiarists get hold of their work, they dumb it down spiritually, as Charles Dickens did with Abby's beautiful work in A Christmas Carol. And I can prove that. If you read my paper about A Christmas Carol, I have proven that Dickens did that, dumbed down Abby's more spiritual writing, which the original author never would have done, see? And Poe would have done that, except Mathew published The Raven in its entirety, in its pristine form, in American Review. All he did was to, as a reviewer, he apparently got an advance copy, and he had the one that Mathew had shared with him, and he scooped it in the New York Evening Mirror by a couple of days. January 29, 1845, he published it under his own name, but he couldn't change it because he already knew that Mathew had published it in the American Review. So he took out one of Mathew and Abby's, I believe, favorite words, sublunary, and changed it with human being. But so that was one or two other very minor changes. He couldn't change it very much. So The Raven in American Review is precisely as Mathew submitted it under blank quarrels. See? Only Poe took out one of Mathew's favorite words, sublunary, that I think was probably there because it was one of his and Abby's favorite words. It's all obvious. It all ties together. It's all of a piece. It's just so outrageous that nobody can take it. But it kind of goes with the spiritual awakening. I think a spiritually awake society would not be fooled by these things. Only a materialistic society and materialistic scholars and spiritually ignorant persons would be fooled by this. Therefore, whether I can convince anybody or not, as society awakens spiritually over the next however long it's going to be, nobody knows, they will see it immediately, as opposed to materialistic people who look at my presentation and think I'm a nutcase. A spiritually awakened society, it's going to be a word to the wise. They're going to see one or two things that I've said, and it's going to be enough, and they're going to look at it and they say, of course Charles Dickens couldn't have possibly written this. Of course Elizabeth Barrett, stuck her thumb in this, and couldn't have been the real author, Of course Edgar Allan Poe couldn't have written The Raven. It'll be obvious to them. It'll just take me cluing them in, and they'll go take it from there, and they'll see it, and it'll be obvious to them. So a lot of what I'm doing here is for posterity, because I know that people who are wedded to materialism, they are short-circuited in their a priori assumptions. They cannot see it because they're short-circuited. Everything I say, they reinterpret so fast. It's decoded into their belief system so quickly that they are not even aware that they're doing it. If you could look at it as like a macro in Microsoft Word, that is a series of programmed, actions. Well, there's a series of programmed thoughts that takes everything I say and unconsciously retranslates it just like that, because what's in that macro? What's in that macro is religion is a myth created by man to avoid the fear of death. That's one of them. All of the materialistic philosophical assumptions are in there. Being deer in the headlights in front of the camera, I can't think of all of them, but that's one of them. So another one is that I'm self-deluded. That would be an assumption. I must be self-deluded because I must be on an ego trip to claim to have written these famous works in a past life. Well, no, actually, I was that good as Matthew. And I can prove it if anybody would take the time to look at it. That's a good poem. All of these are good poems, So that's another assumption. There's nothing wrong with my sanity. I have a master's in counseling. I'm quite sane. I am not a megalomaniac. I'm not self-deluded. So you can throw that one out, But all these assumptions come in that will explain away, and they're so fast you don't even know you're doing it, So I would suggest, you can meditate. I would suggest meditating and watching your thoughts. I can get to the point in meditation, and I'm not an experienced meditator, but I can get to the point that I can watch my thoughts arise. And it's a very interesting exercise. You don't know what kind of thoughts are coming up in your mind, but slow yourself down to where you can watch these things come up. You can observe these macros firsthand and see what associations you're getting. And then question them. Does this really hold up? There is a book by Benito Reyes, R-E-Y-E-S, and let me see if I can remember the title. It's called, well, let me go get it. I'll just use the magic of editing and I'll get the book itself. All right, here we go. This is called The Scientific Proofs of the Existence of the Soul by Benito F. Reyes. I've got a signed copy, actually, from my friend Jeff Keane sent it to me many years ago. I'm about halfway through. You can see my book right there. If you want to seriously delve into this question of materialism and whether there is a non-material aspect of man, I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend sticking with it, because it will attack those assumptions and defeat them if you let it, unless you, just block it or stop reading. I dare you to read this book and actually read it, So Benito F. Right now, here's something kind of interesting. I just feel like rambling today. What is it? I'll go to an hour. At the back of this book is a poem, because all of this is very highly intellectual. But here, this is Appendix A. It's called Stranger-Child, by B.F. Reyes, published in Philippines Free Press, Manila, December 22nd, 1934. right here. Listen to the meter of this. Hear me, child, and judge me rightly, if I tell the truth or lie. In the heart of man is written sorrow of the earth and sky. Sound familiar? In the hour of many voices of the holy silent night, you were born to bring us tidings of great joy and rich delight. Lo, he comes, the prophets told us, he, the promised Prince of Love, who shall make the sky an Eden for the vulture and the dove, and the earth wherein the grasses creeping low the serpent lies, with his magic wand of power he shall make a paradise. Exact same meter. And a man of faith. Isn't that interesting? I think what we have here is that this was, back in the 19th century, a meter that was a sacred meter, a meter that was used by spiritual and religious people. I could be wrong about that. A historian might set me straight, but that's my impression. And Matthew used this sacred meter. You know, I'm not sure where to go from there. I guess I'm done. I can wrap it up now, less than an hour. I hope some of you found it interesting. I stumbled a whole bunch. There's going to be a lot of those dissolves. I really prefer dissolves to hard cuts and editing, but my system is kind of slow. I'd like them to be a little faster. I don't know how to speed them up. Maybe there's a way. So they're a little slower dissolves than I'd like, but there'll be a lot of those in this one. The gist of it is that I found yet another of Matthew's works, his clowning Victor Borgia type humorous works. Is basically Ethan Spike in verse, but I was right. He did submit at least one serious piece, unsigned, smack in the middle of all of this, see? And so there we have it. I keep saying that I might not create another one of these blog entries for a while, and then 2 days later something comes up and I do another one. But I won't actually have all of these antiquarian volumes. There's one that I'm missing. It doesn't actually have any of K.N. Pepper's poetry. It has letters to the editor. It has him visiting New York City. Supposedly, K.N. Pepper goes to visit the editor of the Knickerbocker in New York City and writes about his adventures in New York City. Now, whether he really did that or not, as Mathew Franklin Whittier, I don't know. But it reads exactly like Ethan Spike and any number of other characters, country bumpkins, that Matthew has had going to the big city. I mean, it is exactly, and I could read you several, and I may do that. I don't know if there's a real point to it, but I mean, it's really not necessary. It is Mathew Franklin Whittier's style, and you would not be able to tell the difference hardly between this and Ethan Spike going to New York City, which he does. And then Joshua Greening in Yankee Doodle, who goes to New York City as a bumpkin, and his earliest, Joe Strickland, who was a country character from Vermont, who went to the big city, to New York. So K.N. Pepper goes to New York just like all of Matthew's other characters, where you can barely tell them apart. I'm surprised somebody didn't notice. So I don't have a physical copy of that one. I can't find one, but all of the other ones I will have physical copies of. I'm not sure it's necessary to go into this any further. I don't want to belabor it too much. I just want to show the interconnections here, and I'm just scratching the surface. If the amount of evidence I've shown isn't satisfying to skeptics, that's because I'm now over an hour, and I can't show it all. I don't have time. I could, if I wanted to take all day, I could show you all the connections. So that's it for now.